Welcome back to the Gentleman's Gazette. In today's video, we'll hop into our time machine again, going back to the glorious 50s and the styles to determine what did men really wear. When you think of the 1950s, you probably think of good times, rock and roll, and of course Elvis. Maybe you think about the dawn of TV dinners, or that the polio vaccine was invented. Well, with all that positive energy, it wasn't enough to prevent the popularization of polyester. Although invented in the 1940s, the 50s were the decade where synthetic fibers in menswear spread like a plague. With all that said, the 50s were certainly cheerier than the 1940s. It was the age of increasing comfort and convenience thanks to Hamburger Helper. Oh no, that came in the 70s. The 50s did see, however, the birth of the teenager and the rebellious youth, and the different fashions and styles that came along with it. After all, World War II was over. Rations had been loosened or abolished altogether, and it was time to focus on the nice things in life: travel, food, and of course, fashion. With the prices of fabric rapidly decreasing, it was an opportunity for men to have more clothes, which also meant they now had more casual clothes. The 50s saw an explosion of casual clothes that was fueled by stars like James Dean, Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, and Marlon Brando. Hollywood had defined the fashions since the 20s, and their hold over the public imagination grew stronger and stronger in the 50s. So with all that said, what did men really wear? Let's start from the top. If other decades give us any indication of what would happen to hatwear, you might assume that they became less popular. Wrong. In fact, the 50s saw a resurgence of hatwear. Responsible for this renaissance was the fact that men now could dress up again and wear something they liked instead of a uniform they had to wear. Some would continue to wear the fedora, but a lot of other styles were available at their disposal now. In the summers, some may sport a boater or a Panama hat or a straw hat. To learn more about those, check out our guides here. Flat caps were around, people wore them for sports or for a more casual look, but they were a lot more streamlined and less voluminous than the earlier models. Now, in my mind, the biggest thing that happened in the 50s was the color. There was a lot more color in menswear, which I think was positive. In previous decades, hats used to be black or gray or maybe navy. Now we're enjoying hats in all different hues. They also upgraded the headbands, sometimes adding bird feathers for more individualization and color, or different pleats. Basically, headbands and hats were somewhat of an outlet for creativity. Now let's talk about what's underneath the head. Hair. Much like the 1940s, hair was very important in the 50s. Yes, I just told you men did wear hats, but some skipped them and that was okay. They focused more on their hair and their style. Overall, hairstyles were bigger and more complex than in previous decades for men. To achieve those glorious, waxy hairstyles, you use something called pomade or pomade. You may recall Murray's or Sweet Georgia Brown. That stuff's still around today, but it can rub off on your head in your headband or your pillowcase or anything else that touches your head. In fact, for me, when I used it, I got a whole lot of pomade acne, which is terrible, so I stopped using it. Men back then would typically have a comb with them so they can get the hairstyle they wanted and touch up on it no matter where they were. Popular 1950s hairstyles were the pompadour, the jelly roll, also known as a Doc's R's, and the slick back. The pompadour was brushed backwards and stood high above the forehead. If you've seen pictures of Elvis, you've likely seen that style before. It was pretty popular with the rock and roll scene at the time. The jelly roll was achieved by curling the hair along the side, all leading to a point in the middle front. This style was taken to the extreme by the Teddy Boys in Britain, and because of that, it was probably immortalized and heavily associated with that group. The slickback style speaks for itself. Men like Cary Grant would wear it. It typically came with a side part. The side of the head was a bit longer than what you see in maybe Peaky Blinders or in earlier styles. In terms of facial hair, most men were shaven in the 50s. A youthful, sporty, yet masculine appearance was important, and so youthfulness was associated with a shaven look. Older men still sported beards, and some of them even mustaches. James Dean, on the other hand, popularized the somewhat rougher, less shaven look with a bit of stubble, which was a novelty at the time. Now, what about eyewear? Well, thanks to the movie stars, sunglasses had really become a symbol of wealth and style. Really, they served practical purpose, but it was much more about glamour and representing success. Of course, the sunny climate in California helped Hollywood to shoot movies outside, and so sunglasses came in handy. Because the purchase of sunglasses rose significantly in the 1950s. For women, the famous style was the cat-eye style, as popularized by Audrey Hepburn. For men, spectacles took the shape of a thick-rimmed plastic frame, as inspired by Hollywood actors and icons at the time, such as Buddy Holly or Phil Silvers. Brown-line glasses were also still popular at the time, and more importantly, they could come in different colors: black, blue, orange, imitation tortoiseshell, or even clear frames were seen on men in the 50s. So what happened to the waistcoat in the 50s? Well, it wasn't as essential anymore as it was in previous decades for the business suit, and so some men skipped it. Now, young men, especially aspiring young men, would wear the vest. However, they would often wear a contrasting vest, and that could be contrasting in the material. For example, a knit vest in a different color, or a wool doeskin vest. Some waistcoats had lapels, others didn't. Some had 2 pockets, others 4. Overall, if you wore a waistcoat, it was a fashion choice, not a necessity for heating purposes. Now, a very few select men would keep wearing the 3-piece suit with the matching vest, but it wasn't as popular during the 50s. So with that being said, what did men wear on their torsos? As in the 1940s, the shirt collar had now firmly evolved to be attached to the shirt, unlike in the 1920s or 19-teens. Detachable collars were hardly around anymore and only reserved for special evening functions, really. Think about black tie, white tie, or morning wear. And even then, it was perfectly acceptable at this time to wear a soft turn-down collar with your black tie tuxedo ensemble. The few men who chose detachable collars typically wore plastic collars or Trubinized collars. To learn more about it, check out our older video here. In terms of style, the 50s saw somewhat of a revival of the club collar with the rounded corners. Other than that, the spear point collar was still around, and so was a collar with shorter points. Because the collars were softer than before, most of them were buttoned down, or they had a tab, or you still wore them with a collar clip or a collar pin. Initially in the 50s, shirt colors were bold, but as the decade went on, they became more pastel, less extreme, both in color and in pattern. But overall, a more humble approach was taken towards business wear towards the later part of the 1950s. Some may argue that the shirt just got quieter, so the ties could shine more in all their colorful brightness. Some men still wore cufflinks, but the barrel cuff had become really popular at the time. And because the waistcoat was often gone now, you'd find at least one chest pocket on the left side of a shirt. Now, the 50s had its fair share of bold, colorful ties. Yet, in the 50s, you could wear a suit as a man without having to wear a tie or a bow tie. That meant leaving your shirt unbuttoned or wearing a shirt with a camp collar that wasn't meant to be buttoned in the first place. Typically, the top button was undone, maybe the top 2. Unless you were James Dean, then you could button up your shirt a lot further down. As you can see, James Dean was quite an iconic man of fashion in the 50s, and to learn more about his style and the details, check out our in-depth video here. Now, as I said before, a big novelty of the 50s was the spread of casual clothing. No, casual back then didn't mean what casual means today. So what did they actually wear? Because of the lowered prices for fabric, remember polyester? Yeah, everyone hates it, but still, it helped men to afford more clothes. That meant they didn't just have to buy dress shirts, they could also have an Hawaiian shirt or a t-shirt and just have a broader approach to clothing in general. I mean, honestly, the whole t-shirt fashion and craze that lasts on to this day started in 1951 with Marlon Brando in the movie A Streetcar Named Desire. In that movie, Brando famously wore his undershirt with nothing on top of it. Back in the day, that must have felt like someone just showing up with their underwear. Back to casual shirts then. They had stripes, colorful checks, and geometric patterns. Even corduroy in a kind of fine whale cord was popular. This started due to the popularity of knit shirts, which were more popular during the colder months of the year. Another form of shirt that was rather popular back then was the gaucho, which is the word for a South American cowboy. The gaucho shirt was simply put a pullover shirt that had an open collar. The exact spread of the collar would change throughout the decade, depending on the preferences of style. The open collar was typically fastened with a zip or with a button and a loop. Depending on how casual the occasion was, men could wear their camp collar shirts sometimes untucked. In that case, the hem was cut straight all around, and sometimes they had side pockets at the bottom, as you would maybe know them from pajamas. By the way, to learn more about pajamas and sleepwear or casual wear for the domestic home life, check out this video. So what about ties? They were still widely popular even at the workplace, but some men opted to go without them, and that was okay. In terms of sizes, typically you had one for wider spread collars that was about 3.5 inches wide, and then a slimmer width of about 2 inches for narrower collars. Most ties were tipped now, unlike in the 30s where most stuff was untipped. You could still find untipped ties though. 50s ties came in a huge variety of patterns and colors, including center medallions or center patterns, which were much harder to produce because if you have something printed on a tie and it has to be centered at the top and the bottom, nothing can shift towards production. So they're much harder to produce than, let's say, a polka dot or a geometric pattern that is the same all over the tie. That being said, abstract patterns, fantastical patterns, as well as geometric patterns in bold colors and multicolors were popular. The material range was rayon, polyester, silk, wool, or even cotton. Also, men did wear knit ties in the 50s. Towards the later part of the 50s, ties, just like shirts, toned down a bit. The patterns became less extreme, and so did the colors. What about other forms of neckwear? Yes, men still did wear bow ties. And at the very beginning of the 50s, the bow tie was bigger and wider. Towards the mid-50s, the bow tie had become quite slim and a little longer, which was a typical 1950s look. In the 40s, things were shorter and fatter. So the 50s bow ties are very characteristic when you watch an old movie or photos. Also, it seems like the color range of bow ties in the 50s was really expanded. Before, black was of course popular, maybe navy with polka dots, but now you had pastel tones and patterns in chartreuse and ochre. While self-tie bow ties and neckties were still the standard, some men felt it wasn't convenient enough, they didn't know how to properly tie a tie, and because of that, you find all these clip-on bow ties or tuck-on bow ties, or whatever it is. There was no standardized mechanism. Some had a band that was elastic around it, others just an open hook. But the overall idea of not tying your own neckwear became firmly established in the 1950s. How convenient. All you need now is an electric pencil sharpener. Nothing makes you look like a schoolboy like a pre-tied tie or especially bow tie. We put together a video for you that explains how to tie a bow tie the easy way for beginners. If you follow it, you can do it. It's fairly simple. It's really like tying your shoe just on your neck. It takes a little practice, but most everyone can do it, including you. And if you're not sure about tie knots, we put together popular tie knots with hands-on, easy step-by-step tutorials that you can follow so you don't never have to wear clip-on ties or bow ties. In terms of suits and jackets, those were still around in the 1950s. Early in the decade, you still found a typical American sack suit, no front darts, cut very straight and more baggy with a center vent. Lapels were a bit narrower, there was also a bit less shoulder padding. The buttoning point was quite a bit lower, and the bottom button on a single-breasted jacket usually set in line with the pockets. Overall, suits were rather conservative. The most popular color was probably gray, but you could also find blacks or browns or navies in suiting. Overall, the mid to late 50s were a very somber time, and you typically saw a gray suit with a white shirt. Frankly, I have tons of tailoring magazines from the 50s from Germany, and if you look at those suits, they all look very chiseled. there's no wrinkle anywhere. So they used heavier fabrics. They still had, horsehair interlinings, floating canvas, but much stiffer than what you're used to these days from Naples, for example. Fabrics were wools or flannels, but people also liked mohair. If you're not familiar with it, it's an expensive fiber. It is often blended with wool for evening wear because it has a sparkle. It really is much more coarse than a wool. It's not soft at all, but it doesn't wrinkle, and it's a cool material. I like it. Double-breasted jackets were around in the 50s, but single-breasted ones were more popular. In line with a single-breasted jacket, the double-breasted jacket had a low buttoning point. The lapels were a bit wider, but not too wide. The tips were often rounded, or more heavily rounded than you might see that today. The late 50s saw the emergence of the more continental style or Roman style suit, which was invented by Brioni. Brioni is still around today, even though under different ownership, but back then it was founded by Gaetano Savini and Nazareno Fonticoli in Rome. And they had a very distinct style. It was narrower. Unlike the American sack style suit, it had darts. It was a bit shorter. It had all hallmarks of the traditional tailored suit, and it became really popular with the elegant men. Also, the American sack suit typically had a center vent, whereas the Roman style jacket had side vents. And if you look at jackets today, most jackets still have side vents. That goes back to that period of time with a Roman style suit where this became just much more popular. Also, the original Roman jacket often had more elegant jetted pockets, not flap pockets, and oftentimes they were slightly angled to create a more dynamic look. Now, of course, the suit jacket was just one thing. The 50s was also the decade of the leisure jacket. Yes, to the office, men would still wear mostly suits, but once they were home, they wore more comfortable stuff. Think of a cardigan or a jumper or sweater. That was rather popular. Typically, they had bright colors in green. They sometimes had multiple colors knitted into it, and color was a big thing in the 50s. Now, if you weren't just home, but you would go out and about in a non-work function, oftentimes men would start wearing sport coats. These were jackets that had more casual features, such as patch pockets. They were in colors that were bolder, tartans or plaids, or just something that was more fun and more outgoing than the typical somber business suit. I mean, there were lots of variations, 2, 3, 4 buttons, little details and changes, but most of them would have patch pockets and have a 2-button style. In America, there were several rebellious youth groups. One of them was the jock, the other popular one, the greaser. The jock was the typical cool kid in high school who was part of the sports team. He would wear a varsity jacket, which meant it was a wool torso with leather sleeves. It also had sports or school logos embroidered or an emblem on it, typically quite large. It basically was a badge of honor that signaled that they were an accomplished sportsman, or just part of a team. The greasers, on the other hand, were typically men that wore big hairstyles with leather motorcycle jackets, white t-shirt, and jeans. They were extremely rebellious to the idea of the quiet 1950s life. It is said that Stanley Kramer was inspired by a small motorcycle gang when he came up with the idea for the movie The Wild One. This movie, along with On the Waterfront from 1954 and Rebel Without the Cause from 1955, really made this whole style more established with America's youth. James Dean, Marlon Brando became icons, and even Elvis wore part of that greaser style stuff. So what did greasers wear on their feet? Well, actually, some of them wore Converse shoes, which used to be the gym shoe. Now it was more acceptable in casual wear. Or they wore leather biker boots. Now, across the pond, things were very different with the Teddy Boys. The Ruth Rebellion there took on a pseudo-Edwardian take. With their big jelly-rolled hair, lovingly called the Ducks R's, they wore interpretations of frock coats or drape jackets that were sometimes trimmed with velvet. Paired with a waistcoat, watch chain, bow tie or bolo tie, and brothel creeper shoes, the outfit was perfect for the Teddy Boy. So what are creepers? Well, brothel creepers or creepers are somewhat casual shoes, often with a suede upper, but it can also be in a smooth leather with a characteristic thick crepe sole. Typically, they're very low rise and not anything I would wear today. What about trousers? Honestly, they didn't change too much since the 40s. They were still cut wider than trousers today, with the hem on average being about 9.5 inches wide open. Many trousers still featured 2 pleats, but you could also find flat front pants now. Some trousers were uncuffed, but you would see a lot more cuffed in the 50s, and typically they were 2.5 inches or about 6 to 6.5 centimeters tall. On some sporting trousers, the cinch belt in the back even made a comeback, but it was short-lived. Men in the 50s did not only wear trousers, but they also wore shorts. Often they were pleated and pretty much cut like a pair of dress trousers, but they had bolder patterns. Plaids, tartans, checks in bolder colors. In full Bermuda fashion though, you would wear them with over-the-calf socks. Yes, knee-high socks, just like in the Bermudas. So what would a 1950s man wear with his sport coat or his suits? Well, the typical Oxfords and brogues in black, brown were still around. Sometimes you could also find white or off-white shoes. They were popular, and so were saddle shoes. Perhaps the strangest part of 1950s footwear is the winkle picker, which is a very pointed shoe that looks pretty odd. It's probably great for digging holes in the garden, but there is a reason this fad was short-lived. Now, a 50s shoe trend that survived until today are the chukka boots. To learn more about it, we have a dedicated guide to it. We also review the Clark's chukka boot, which has become synonymous as the chukka boot, so you can learn more about that in these videos over here. Again, color was a big thing in the 50s, and that was part of the shoes. Elvis, for example, popularized the blue suede shoes. I know, not so popular again today, but back then you could totally wear that. Oh yeah, let's not forget, leather slippers became really popular for around your home. They were padded a little more and comfortable. Overcoats in the 1950s were interesting. Often they were single-breasted, sometimes also double-breasted, but overall they were cut much wider and baggier. Also, they were cut from heavier cloth, so they would drape nicely. Colors were brown, gray, or black, but their fabrics had a much larger color depth, oftentimes by adding multiple colors into the weave, therefore allowing you to wear it with all sorts of color in your hat or your pants or your shoes. In terms of popularity, you see a lot of double-breasted overcoats in photos and videos, but you can also spot single-breasted ones. If they were double-breasted, they typically had big patch pockets. Personally, I'm a big fan of double-breasted overcoats because when it's cold outside, you want that double overlapping layer of cloth because that keeps you warm. Another popular overcoat style of the 50s was the Ulster. The same is true for the paletot overcoat, but we also discussed it in detail earlier, so I won't do that here. Last but not least, let's look at the 1950s accessories. Belts were a lot more popular than suspenders. Also, woven leather belts or just interesting colors and changes were something that men would wear at the time. Coupled with unique looking belt buckles, it really was a way for a man to express his individuality. Wearing a scarf, also known as muffler, was definitely something most gentlemen would do during the 1950s. Men would also wear gloves during the winter, which were nice leather dress gloves in bolder colors. In our Fort Belvedere shop, you can find gloves that are more interesting in color than the usual gloves, and the same with scarves that are double-sided. They're very much in line with what the 50s were about. An increase in color and expression of individuality. The same was true for socks and pocket squares. They were a bit bolder than in previous or following decades. So in conclusion, the 50s were a colossal decade for men's fashion. Why? Because a lot of color came back, a lot of casual items came into style, and that was entirely new compared to previous decades. It also helped that consumerism was booming, people were willing to spend, and they wanted to enjoy themselves again. Honestly, there's such a wide range of clothing items from the 1950s that it was hard to press it all into this video, but I hope we've given you a good enough overview. In today's video, I actually opted for a very casual take on this decade, wearing a bold pair of tartan plaid trousers in green, navy, white, and red and charcoal. My polo shirt is white and simple. I don't have one with a chest pocket, otherwise I would have worn that. But this is modern, this is not original 1950s vintage. My belt is woven with some leather and a gold brass buckle, and I'm pairing it with a pinky ring that also has a bloodstone in red and dark green, picking up the colors of my shorts. I'm wearing them Bermuda style with a pair of over-the-calf socks. I opted for a charcoal pair with clogs. It's a solid color with a little pattern. And I'm wearing a pair of PF Flyers in an off-white color that matches my belt. They're very similar to Converse shoes. They have this thick rubber sole or a canvas-style sneaker, lots of eyelets, and overall rather casual. If you're interested in high-quality over-the-calf socks, such as this pair here, you can find it in our shop here.